This is a population density map of Illinois. Looking at it, it's insane how much Chicago stands out. Now, I know this isn't something particularly unique. I mean, the idea of a state having one or two major cities that house most of the population isn't rare, especially in the US. There's Portland, Oregon, Phoenix, Arizona, and Baltimore, Maryland, just to name a few. In fact, there's even a name for this, known as the primate cities. But what makes this Illinois-Chicago relationship so unique is that this is possibly the most exaggerated example of this trend, with the Chicago metropolitan area housing 9.5 million people out of the state's total 12.5 million population. Or in other words, about 75% of Illinois lives in the Chicago metro area. But why is that? I mean, how did Chicago come to dominate Illinois like no other? Well, it's a combination of a lot of things. And like everything, we have to start from the beginning. Initially, the Chicago area was inhabited by a number of native Algonquin groups for centuries, until 1673, when French explorers Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette traveled through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River, making contact with various Native American tribes and mapping the region. Their exploration was part of a broader French effort to expand trading networks and establish alliances with indigenous peoples. From then on, the area became part of New France, becoming a key area because of its location near a portage, which connected the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. It quickly became an important connection between the cities of Quebec and New Orleans, especially for the fur trade. Centuries ago, and even to this day, transporting goods via water is much cheaper than through land. Without the Chicago portage, the whole Midwest would have been much harder to settle and develop. Despite all this, the French never really settled in the Chicago area. Their primary focus was on the fur trade and maintaining relationships with Native American tribes, rather than establishing permanent European settlements. The French presence in the region was mainly characterized by a network of forts, trading posts, and mission outposts scattered throughout the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley, rather than large towns or cities. Eventually, the French and Indian War happened, which ended in the British gaining control of the area in 1763. It was only in the 70s came to Chicago, Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, who's believed to be from the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti. He established a successful farm and trading post there in the 1780s, and is commonly referred to as the founder of Chicago. Following American victory in the Revolutionary War, the British ceded a massive plot of land to the United States in the Midwest, known as the Northwest Territory, containing modern-day Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota east of the Mississippi River, and of course, Illinois. A few more wars came about, such as the Northwest Indian War in 1785 against a united group of Native American nations, and then the War of 1812 against the British, before the US finally solidified total control over the Great Lakes region, with all hostilities ending. Shortly after, Illinois itself was finally granted statehood in 1818. Despite this big step for Illinois, the original state looked a whole lot different than the Illinois we know today. Looking at this map, the multicolored lines indicate where the original borders of Illinois were placed. The northern border of the state in 1818 began 60 miles further south than it does today, and it doesn't include Chicago or Lake Michigan in its original borders. Additionally, much of Illinois' rich agricultural center had yet to be thoroughly explored. Thus, Illinois' statehood began with most of its population living alongside the Mississippi River, as evidenced by its first capital and largest city, Kaskaskia. Kaskaskia was a natural choice to be the capital of the new state, as it was close to St. Louis, sat near other important Mississippi River trade outposts, and had served as the capital over the Illinois Territory before that. It was here in Kaskaskia that congressional delegate Nathaniel Pope argued that Illinois' new borders were insufficient, and that in order for the state to maximize its economy, it should extend 60 miles north to include Lake Michigan shoreline and the mouth of the Chicago River. Pope argued to Congress that Illinois would reap wonderful economic benefits if Lake Michigan and Illinois were entirely connected by water, and promised that Illinois would be a non-slavery state if their land claims were extended northward. Congress accepted Pope's proposal, and later that year, Illinois' modern borders were formed. At the time, word was relatively slow to spread about the potential economic benefits of Chicago's location. Instead, many dashed to the rest of Illinois to take advantage of the rich soil. Farming communities were quickly established, and many farms filled the unexplored areas of the state. Early farmers in Illinois found extreme success because of the state's river delta soil, its flat prairie grass landscape, and its central geography in relation to the populated East and the pioneer country of the Western Plains. Illinois became characterized by its thriving farmlands and agricultural communities, and as such, it seemed unlikely that a massive city would form in the center or south.
What is also unlikely is that your data isn't being used for malicious purposes though. And for that, I'd like to introduce the sponsor of this video, Proton VPN. In general, VPNs allow you to change your public-facing IP and pick the country you're connecting from, so you can privately browse the internet or bypass any regional restrictions you'd be dealing with anywhere in the world. With Proton VPN though, this is all enhanced. They have an extensive network of over 8,500 servers in over 110 countries that you can connect to, a policy of storing absolutely no data that's verified by independent auditors, ensuring complete privacy, an integrated ad blocker, and seamless compatibility with services like Netflix, for example, which lets you access the American version if you're in Europe and vice versa, so you can get access to your favorite shows while traveling. Above all, Proton VPN is designed for users who prioritize their digital privacy and security. Even the inventor of the World Wide Web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, is part of their board of directors. So sign up using my link in the description below to get 64% off and join the over 100 million users already using it today.
Chicago's geography, on the other hand, presented a well of untapped potential for an urban center to grow, with river and lake travel being an exciting prospect for connecting Chicago with the whole continent. The Chicago River mouth feeds into the Des Plaines River and quickly connects with the Illinois River. The Illinois River cuts directly across the entire state and merges with the Mississippi River much further south. The mouth of the Chicago River then grants Chicago access to much of central and southern Illinois, and even further south via the Mississippi River, or potentially further west via the Missouri River. Additionally, Chicago is accessible for those traveling from the east by water. The St. Lawrence River can be traversed all the way west to Lake Ontario, then to Lake Erie, then Huron, to Michigan, and then eventually to Chicago. Thus, Chicago represented a connecting point between all of the Northeast, the South, and the unexplored West of North America. From an economic and cultural perspective, it's increasingly clear how Chicago grew to be the powerhouse we know of today. That being said, it was only in 1833 that the town of Chicago was incorporated, with a population of 350 in the newly created Cook County. It wasn't until railroad and real estate tycoon William B. Ogden moved to Chicago in 1836 that Chicago really started to boom. He became the first mayor of Chicago, advocating for the city to raise tax revenue for new infrastructure, which he also presented new designs for. He even used his own money to fund some of it. Despite only serving a single term as mayor, he was a leading investor in the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which allowed shipping from the Great Lakes through Chicago to the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico, when completed in 1848. Later in his life, he raised enough money for the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad, the first rail line in Chicago. The city would go on to become the transportation hub of the United States, with its road, rail, water, and later air connections. By 1860, the city had become the nation's processing hub, and with 112,000 people, the 9th largest city in the US, up from the 92nd just 20 years earlier. By 1870, Chicago had grown to become the nation's 2nd largest city, and one of the largest cities in the world. Between 1870 and 1900, Chicago grew from a city of 300,000 to nearly 1.7 million, and was the fastest growing city in world history. And despite being the political center of the state and being home for many years to future President Abraham Lincoln, the capital city, Springfield, had just modest growth, going from 2,500 people in 1840 to 34,000 in 1900. As is frequently the case in US states, the most populous city is often avoided being given the title of capital, as to avoid giving it too much power, and to provide a division of power between urban and rural interests. Though another factor is that Springfield is just much more centrally located, which is ideal for capital cities. These are the reasons why in states like New York, Albany is the capital instead of NYC, or Sacramento being the capital of California instead of LA, and so on. At this point in time, urban Chicago had already been dominating heavily over the agricultural breadbasket throughout the state, but now it seemed as if Chicago would forever dominate over the rest. The development and popularization of air travel exacerbated Chicago's connections to other important cities. Even without its prior advantages, Chicago's central location within the US might have made it an important air travel hub, as it's an excellent choice for layovers when traveling from coast to coast. It's also key to remember that cities accumulate advantages that make them grow exponentially. If a city already has an extensive railroad and highway system, it makes sense to build an airport there, creating synergy that, you guessed it, spurs on further economic growth, which of course Chicago benefited from. The Midway International Airport was the first airport to open in Illinois in 1928, then known as Chicago Air Park, and is also the fifth oldest airport in the US as a whole. At this time, Chicago's main economic driver was manufacturing and processing, and its prowess only kept growing. During World War II, the city adapted its many factories to focus on producing goods for the war effort, from torpedoes to field rations. During the 1950s, Chicago made 10% of the world's steel. As the suburbanization movement of the 1950s and 60s swept over Chicago, the city saw large populations leaving and moving to satellite cities outside Cook County, such as Aurora, Joliet, Naperville, which have gone on to become the second, third, and fourth largest cities in Illinois outside of Chicago, each with populations over 150,000. While the city has maintained its dominating presence over Illinois ever since, in more recent years, Chicago's population has tapered off, and it is now only the fourth biggest US city by population, and the third biggest metropolitan area in the US at 9.2 million people. That's the thing though. It's quite telling to point out the next largest cities in the state today are all still a part of the larger Chicago metropolitan area. And if we're to look at the largest cities that can't be considered part of Chicago, that'd be Rockford with just 150,000 inhabitants and Springfield with around 115,000. Naturally, Chicago's position as a big city has created a sense of distinction from most of the state. In the southwest corner of the state, the metropolitan area known as Greater St. Louis extends into the state, with approximately a fourth of its population within Illinois. This area is known as Metro East, the second most populous metropolitan area in Illinois, with 700,000 residents. The biggest discrepancy regarding culture, economic activities, and values between Chicago and the rural areas of Illinois lies here, which are concentrated in the southern parts of the state. There are significant differences in the way the people of the Chicago area and southern Illinois live their lives and how they look at the world. The south of the state is even considered by some pundits to be within the Bible Belt, the most religious part of the country. The economy here is heavily centered on farming, with corn and soybeans accounting for 80% of southern Illinois' agricultural land. In fact, if you look at this map, 30% of Illinois is literally covered by cornfields, with around 11,200 fields per every 1,000 acres. So the culture is pretty traditional, to say the least. Meanwhile, Chicago's economy has become extremely diverse over time. While before it was mainly centered around manufacturing, today no single sector of their economy dominates more than 13% of Chicago's GDP, making it one of the most diverse economies in the US. Also, their culture is hard to summarize, but it's multicultural, centered on modern economic activities, and usually in sync with the trends and habits of other metropolitan areas. The split between rural and urban areas is subtly conveyed by how many Chicago residents refer to areas outside of the city as downstate, even to those areas that are actually to the west of it. In recent years, these divisions between the different areas of the state have become more apparent. For many living outside of the metro Chicago area, there's a general resentment that comes from the feeling that Chicago gets to determine the economic and social policies for the entire state. And those living downstate essentially have to take a back seat when it comes to elections, policy proposals, and lawmaking. They essentially feel they're not being represented fairly. But of course, this is literally how democracy works. It's not about the geographical areas, but rather what the majority of people want. Another reason is because of the myth that the downstate residents are paying all these taxes for things they ultimately reap no benefits of. and are essentially being drained in order to fund Chicago. Now, I say myth because, quite frankly, it is one. There's been numerous studies done, even from Southern Illinois University, that show it's the complete opposite. Chicago and the suburbs pay into the state the most and receive the least in return, while downstate pays into the state the least and receives the most in return. If you look at this map here, for every dollar Cook County residents send to the state in taxes, they receive about 90 cents back in benefits, and the suburban Chicago counties only receive about 53 cents back. Meanwhile, the state's southernmost counties get back $2.81 in tax revenue for every dollar they put in, and the other counties are heavily funded too. But despite all of this, in 2018, a secessionist movement was founded to lobby Congress to make Chicago the 51st U.S. state, which would allow the rest of Illinois to govern itself without the influence of a major city. Despite how crazy this sounds, about a third of the 102 Illinois counties have passed similar referendums, with every election season seemingly adding more counties to the list. It's probably the most active, growing secession movement in the US today. 51 counties need to pass referendums asserting their desire to separate from Chicago. Then both the Illinois General Assembly and the US Congress would need to approve those counties' request for Chicago to become a 51st state, before finally being signed by the president. The last time Congress admitted into the country a state that had been separated from another, it was under extenuating circumstances. That state was West Virginia, which broke off from Virginia in 1863 to remain loyal to the Union rather than join the Confederacy as Virginia had in 1861. So that is to say that this is basically never going to happen. And it's a good thing too, because obviously it would be economically disastrous, given how reliant they are on Chicago's economic output. Their taxes would have to double or triple just to maintain the current level of public services they currently enjoy, which is a bit ironic given the taxes are a reason for leaving. In the end, both sides ultimately need each other. It's too easy to let partisanship and regional differences divide everyone. Chicago's metro, also known as Chicagoland, has a GDP roughly equal to that of Switzerland, which is number 20 in the world, at around $800 billion. And with the rest of the state, it passes $1 trillion, which is around the same as the Netherlands at number 18. Just like every other state, Illinois is definitely stronger when united.
Thank you for watching. And again, thank you to Proton VPN for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to sign up using the link in my description to get 64% off today. See you in the next one.